Have you ever had a data structure that looks like this, that has a set of core properties and a ton of optional properties that are configured based on your particular use cases, and wondered, is there a better way to do this? The answer is yes. You can actually solve this same exact problem using composition with TypeScript, where you would never need to have optional arguments at all. So there's two key concepts that we have to understand within TypeScript in order to solve this problem elegantly. The first one is what is called a union. A union is essentially a way of describing that a property or a value can be multiple types. So in this function, we have this parameter called user ID, and it is made up of what we are expecting to be a string. If we use what is called a union operator, we could essentially describe that this user ID can either be a string or a number. And we can see that by invoking this function with a number and the TypeScript compiler being happy. If we provided a string, it is also happy. However, if we provided a Boolean, it will yell at us. There's two things about unions that are super important. One is you can chain together a bunch of unions, which make it extremely powerful. But the really cool feature of unions is that you can basically use it to construct custom types. Now, what you would be doing with this custom type is essentially creating a type alias. So you would essentially have a user ID that you're describing to be a union of these two things. And what you will do is use that custom type in your function and method signatures throughout your code base that essentially does the same exact thing. However, it makes your code a lot more clean, a lot more concise, and a lot more manageable over time. And so unions are extremely powerful, but they become even more powerful when you combine these things, what is called an intersection. And so an intersection is essentially a way of taking two or more completely different types and essentially combining them together into a new type. It's essentially a way of composing a brand new type, giving many types. So for instance, I have a type here that describes the base user profile, which essentially has an ID and an email. And then I have an extension or a separation of data, which is essentially the business user profile, which contains the business data, such as the business name or the business website. And what I'm doing here is creating a completely new type, which is called a user profile, which consists of a base user profile and a business user profile. And so what that means is that this new type is essentially the merger of these two types. And so when I use that user profile as part of my method signature or my function signature, we will essentially have type safety on whatever is being provided as input to require all of those properties. So if I removed business name and business website, you can see that the TypeScript compiler is yelling at us. That's because our user profile requires both the base user profile properties as well as the business user profile properties. Now that we have a good understanding of unions and intersections, how do we use this to our advantage so that we can get rid of these smelly, stinky optional properties within our object? The first thing that we're going to have to do is separate all of this data. So we have business data, we have personal data, and we have core data. So what we can do is we can create different types that represent those types of data. So we're going to create a business user profile. We're going to keep the business name. We're going to remove the optionality from it. And we're going to do the same thing for personal user profile data. So this is essentially going to contain our age and our sex. Now that we have our three distinctly different types that encapsulate different types of data, how can we do this to construct a new type that always depends on core data, but optionally depends on either business user profile or personal user profile? And we can do that through intersections and unions. So what we can do is we could go down here and create a new type, which is a full user profile that uses the base user profile and intersects it between the union of one or the other. So we could basically say business user profile or a personal user profile. And so what we did here was we created a full user profile type that always contains the base user profile and then optionally contains one or the other. So when you go to use this full user profile, what it's going to tell you to do is one, provide an ID and an email. That is a requirement, right? But it's also going to yell at you because you haven't met the criteria of one or the other. So if we go ahead and we start to give it a business name, right, it still hasn't conformed to the full business user profile. So we're basically going to give it the business website. And now the load full profile actually conforms to a combination of this plus this. If we wanted to provide personal user information instead, and we could do the same thing, we can give it an age of 5 and we can give it a sex of yes, please. Now, not only are you getting type safety in method signatures and you're protecting your code and making it more explicit for the callers to use your methods properly, you can also use the same pattern for React. So for instance, I have a sample application here that renders a user component, and that user component actually takes in properties, and those properties are exactly what we created in the previous section. So we're basically importing the full user profile. And so now when I construct a user component through JSX, it requires it to conform to the interface that we described. And so here's an example of it using the business name and business website. And if I remove this, you can see that React is going to yell at us. I hope you learned something. And if you like this video, please be sure to like and subscribe. And if you have any questions or comments, leave them below.